to really extend my appreciation to Connor for organizing and hosting this event on today, the Days in Reparations, Days in Solidarity for Reparations for African People. It's been mentioned it's part of a tour that we've been involved in. It should also be said that this is something we've been doing now for years and years and years. It's a very important kind of event, in part because it gives white people an opportunity to end your voluntary isolation from the rest of the world, to come and unite with African people who served you so well, even if it has been at the point of the gun, and an opportunity to claim a scientific understanding of this relationship that we have, to struggle against the pure subjectivism that too often informs not only our understanding about this relationship, but our understanding of the world. So I want to thank Connor and Uhuru Solidarity Movement. I also want to express my appreciation to Chairwoman Penny Hess, the chair of the African People's Solidarity Committee. She has been doing this work now since 1976. And a couple of people who were not born at that time. And it has been extraordinarily consistent. I want to say that I have a tremendous amount of appreciation for your coming out. I think it's a really bold statement, your presence. I think that it is part of, it's been an incredible hurdle for white people to get here. Because in part, white people have been for the last several hundred years the subjects of history, and the rest of us have been objects of history. It's only recently that we've even been able to read about ourselves in the first person. As a child, I learned to read very early as a child, and I read stories. I read story of poor Tiny Tim, you know, the Christmas carols, and I learned to cry copious tears for that child. But I never was able to read about Africans and learn to cry for ourselves. And even my emotions were colonized, if you will. And this is the reality that we have experienced as a people. So I want to express an understanding of how difficult it is for white people to cross over this muck that has contaminated your brains, your society, and everything that you have. This relationship that we have with each other has been extraordinarily beneficial to white people, even people living in the Appalachians, as compared to what it has meant to Africans, what it has meant to Mexicans, the indigenous peoples, and oppressed peoples around the world. It has been extraordinarily beneficial. You consider the fact that, as Comrade President Penny Hess just mentioned, the Africans who built the walls for Wall Street, but in part of the reason it was built was to keep the indigenous people from taking back their land. There wouldn't be a single address in this country, a mailbox. Even the poor people who decry the fact that the rent is too high are paying high rent on stolen land. And the peoples whose land, who were the custodians of the land, are in concentration camps that they call Indian reservations. This is the reality that we are contending with, even if it's not immediately obvious to us. I think it's important to say that we're not here just for some kind of purely abstract philosophical discussion. We're here because we are concerned about what's happening in the world. Like me, I'm sure most of the people here don't like the fact that the United States government is employing the Saudis to murder Yemens every day. Every 10 minutes, at least one child in Yemen is dying as a consequence of the war that's funded, led by the United States, using Saudi forces to do that. I'm sure that most people here don't like the fact that you've got people who are starving in Iraq and starving in Afghanistan as a consequence of being occupied by U.S. military forces, and there are other peoples around the world, that you're looking at a world of permanent warfare, that Donald Trump would come into existence as the formal head of state, that people are concerned that the U.S. government under his administration would unilaterally end nuclear treaties with Russia, would unilaterally declare that the Iranian government is now under continuous assault, and that would use warfare, a form of warfare, starvation, through quarantine, economic quarantine of the Iranian government. I'm sure that people are disgusted and concerned about that. That's why some of you were running around saying things like "feel the burn" and looking for solutions. That's why we're here. And many people don't like the idea that we can be in a country where the police can go into a playground and 2 seconds after having arrived, murder a 12-year-old African child in a playground with a play gun without there being any consequences. Or they could murder a child like 7-year-old Ayanna Jones in Detroit in her sleep, in her bed, with there being no consequences to that. So I'm sure people are concerned about that. And I hear that the people are using this incredible word fascism. Fascism is around the corner, etc. And so I think that it's important for us to understand what the hell is going on. And also that Bernie Sanders is not the solution. And I have nothing against old people. Which would be extremely problematic, wouldn't it? So I want to just talk a little bit about that. You know, I read some time ago that the United States government spent a lot of money and resources sending a spaceship to Jupiter. Anybody remember that? A spaceship to Jupiter, because they said it was the end of the universe. It was at the limits of the universe. And they said, we want to get to Jupiter. This is the line that they gave. They didn't say we're looking for minerals, and they didn't say we're looking for the military high ground to dominate the world forever, and they didn't say just in case the ruling class has to get off the earth that they're destroying. But they said that they went to Jupiter because they could discover there the origin of the earth, how things got to be the way they are. And that's something that we need to do. And so right now, we're taking a flight to Jupiter because we need to know how the hell it got to be the way it is, because we want to solve the problem. And you can't solve the problem unless you identify what the real contradiction is. Is the contradiction that we are faced with, because some white people don't like Africa, or most of white people don't like Africa. Is that the real problem? And some people say yes, and feel absolutely guilty because of the deep-seated racism in their brains, etc., and struggle with those kinds of things. But frankly, most people around the world don't give a damn about whether you like us or not, except your dislike for us can be expressed through drone strikes, military aggression, murder in our communities, and things like that. And that understanding helps us to conclude the real question is not whether white people like us. The real question has to do with the fact that white people have the power to do things badly to us if they don't like us. And therefore, the question is not to get white people not to like us, because you could spend several generations, as has already occurred, but to get the power to make sure that whether white people like us or not, you can't do a damn thing to us. In fact, that we can chart our own future. So how do we get this way? How do we become so deluded about this relationship? How this whole notion of the superiority of white people, and of course everybody in this room knows it's a lie, because the white people in this room look in the mirror and you know just how significant you are, how smart you are, how superior you are. You look in the mirror, you have to deal with that. How do we come to this place where the entire world now perceives white people as being this superior, all-knowing, most beautiful? I remember when white people couldn't dance and couldn't sing. And now I see white people controlling whole networks, giving each other awards for being the best singers and the best dancers. How the hell did that happen? So I think it's really important for us to understand that when most of us met white people, that Europe, as it is now known, because it's a relatively recent creation, that Europe, as it is now known, lived under feudalism. And feudalism is the next closest thing to slavery. So that where people were not sold as doing slavery, they were tied to the land that was owned by the nobility. Even the term landlord comes from that period. Even the thing, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, comes from that period. So the landlord was the dominant force during feudalism. And we had a situation from, you're talking about 1,000 years, just about, where Europeans were starving, literally. So under feudalism, you see this reality show they have, Naked and Afraid. Well, under feudalism, that was literally true. That there were certain communities in Europe where people were literally naked, had nothing to wear. This is feudalism. This is obviously something that challenges the notion that's been fed to the rest of us, how Europe rescued us by coming to us. Rudyard Kipling, the great chronicle of the British colonialism, characterized it as the white man's burden. So we have to go and kill and rape and take everything else. We don't want to do it, but it's our burden to bring civilization, and Christianity to the rest of the world. But the reality is that Europe was in a state of starvation between the 4 years of 1347 and 1352. That's 4 years, right? Wow. It had something like at least half the white people on the planet Earth died of plague. In that 4 short years, you can't have an economy of any significance if half the people die in a 4-year period. And then beyond that 4-year period, for 100 years or more, that and other plagues continued to visit Europe. And so much of how Christianity looks today was informed by this deadly plague that visited Europe. That's what self-flagellation and what have you, that's one expression that comes from there. Because God must be punishing us. And so in order to sort of preempt godly punishment, they would have marches of hundreds of people going from village to village and actually whipping themselves bloody. So we do it before God gets us. This was the European. This was Europe that we are talking about. This appeared, they called it the Dark Ages. But it wasn't dark in China. It wasn't dark in much of Africa. It wasn't dark in the Americas and what have you. This was called the Dark Ages, that Europe lived with and experienced. And we call it Europe now, but there was no Europe. The fact is that within the recent period of time, much of what we call Europe and people who live there define themselves primarily in relationship to each other. The Normans and the Saxons and the Celts and all of these people who were always engaged in warfare. This in permanent war. That was what tribal warfare is what characterized that relationship. But the thing that happened that changed the world was that Europe went out, and I say Europe, but handsful of Europeans went out and began to engage. It's romanticized this great period of exploration. No, it was Europe being chased out by starvation, by poverty and disease, and initiated this whole process of what has been called the slave trade and the colonialism. And now, as opposed to Celts and Normans and Saxons and the rest of them engaged primarily in relationship, identifying and defining themselves primarily in relationship to themselves, they now begin to define themselves in relationship to us. This is the origin of the white man. The white man gets born through this process. Europe gets born through this process of slavery and colonialism to begin to define themselves against the rest of us. And of course, even, as you know, part of what happened was the war that was made against the people in what is now characterized as the Middle East, the so-called Holy War that was fought, this looting expedition fought on the banner of Christianity that continues to be fought even as we have this discussion, that also began to help to shape what is now the European consciousness and identity, so that we define the European nation really as being essentially white and Christian. And it's, as I said, a looting expedition. But all of this, including the enslavement of African people, the theft of the lands that we are on now, the theft of this Australia that we are talking about now, the theft, and this is a horrible theft as well, of the lands of Palestine, where Europeans leave Europe and go to Palestine, steal the land, take the land. Said God gave them to them 2,000 years ago. This God that's a real estate agent. And 2,000 years ago, take the land, call themselves, change the name from Palestine to Israel, call themselves Israelis and act like they always been there. This is how Europeans leave Europe, come to this land, kill the indigenous population, take the land, scratch off the name. That's the first thing a criminal does when they steal something. Scratch the name off, call it America, call themselves Americans and act like they always been here. It's a lie. And it's something that's been handed down from generation to generation. And it has become a part of the fabric of the consciousness of especially white people who live in this country. But this is how the whole social system gets born. We have to ask the question. I was faced as a young person with the question, as most Africans are here and around the world, why is it that everywhere I looked as a child growing up, I would see people who looked like me, living in the worst kind of squalor, poverty, violence, and imposed ignorance on the one hand, but every place I looked, I saw white people living well. And of course, the explanation that was given to all of us is the fact, is the thing that, the reason is that way, this great disparity in the conditions of existence between Africans and other people, and now the people who know as Europe or white people, is because white people are more civilized. You ever heard that before? White people are more civilized, and in addition to being more civilized, white people are thrifty. And the rest of us just waste our money. And this is the kind of, this is the explanation that virtually every African child is burdened with in terms of trying to understand who the hell we are, how we happen to live in these circumstances that we live in. Every African child has to live with that. Every, not just a child, but even those who we send into the schools to teach our children have this kind of false understanding of reality. when the truth of the matter, of course, is that this difference that we are talking about is one that has come about as a consequence of slavery and brigandage. Brigandage and slavery. Whole world economy. Karl Marx asked the question, he said that in order for there to be capitalist production, there has to be first an accumulation of capital. He said, but in order for there to be an accumulation of capital, there must be first capitalist production. How do we get out of this vicious circle except by presupposing that there was an accumulation of capital that did not come as a consequence of capitalist production, but was a starting point. He said it was a primitive accumulation. And this primitive accumulation of capital, he said, consists of turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, and turning the indigenous people of the Americas into the mines and what have you, bringing out resources. It included things like the war that was made against China by England in 1841-42, that was called the Opium War, that forced China to become a nation of drug addicts because China did not want to trade its tea to England for opium. And so this is how Europeans do trade. You see what Trump is doing right now. This ain't new. They said, yeah, you're gonna take the opium, we're gonna take the tea, and they fought what they call the Opium War in order to force China to do this. This is how resources came to what we now know as Europe and what became the whole capitalist world. It was turning Vietnam France got most of its colonial resources from Vietnam through drugs. Thousands of actual drug dens under French colonial domination existed in Vietnam, bringing out all kinds of resources, but turning Vietnam into a country of junkies. This is how imperialism, this is how capitalism arose. And it did not arise as something that happened in Manhattan by itself or in Manchester in England. It emerged as a world system. A world system. Capitalism was born out of the world system, and it was this capitalism coming into existence that gave birth and rise to what we now know as white power. This is the reality that we're confronted with. And you cannot keep the world dominated and starving. It's a parasitic social system. And you know what a parasite is. A parasite has to have an organism upon which it can suck the life of. It's like a tapeworm. And you think you're doing something, you eat this little nasty meat that most of the people probably eat, and sometimes you have this parasite in it, and you eat it, and it grows onto you and latches onto your intestines. And it doesn't do anything except sit there and grow. If you're lucky, you got a job, you work. And to get food, you have to cook the food. You do all the work. And no matter how hard you work, you don't get any bigger at all or any stronger. In fact, you continue to get weaker, but the parasite gets bigger and bigger and bigger inside you. That's what capitalism is. It was born as a parasitic social system. The enslavement of African people, that was a parasite. The taking of the land of the indigenous people, that was a parasite. The theft of this land that they call Australia, and the murder of the indigenous people in Australia to take and keep that land, that was a parasite. This is what we are talking about, the rise of capitalism and what capitalism is. And this is why there has to be permanent warfare, because the peoples of the world will not easily surrender all of our resources and the future of our children, the destiny of our people, to some parasite that wants to feast off of us. So there's resistance that's happening all the time. And one of the problems even that you find with the economy is that the success of the people taking back their own resources. Or you have a China that has been a kind of semi-colony for a long period of time that achieves independence, of course, as you know, at the end of the 40s, and now has become a contender with the big guys, with the imperialists. You remember, some of us remember when there used to be this saying that you don't have a Chinaman's chance. They don't say that no more. China has more chances than most of us. But China, you never heard of China marching down the street saying we shall overcome, and the hands up, don't shoot, and Chinese lives matter. In fact, what they did was they sought and patiently, they made a revolution to unite China. And then they took over the resources that were there. And they developed a capacity that they can contend with any power on earth. In fact, we got problems with China in Africa today. And my point, of course, is that this is what's happening. And this is part of the crisis of imperialism, even contention among would-be imperial powers, where it used to just be Europe and America. The pie shrinks. The pie shrinks. What happens, of course, is there's greater contention between those who have relied on being able to get all of those resources. Now they're talking about new trade agreements and guns and the ability to take what they want from the people, to take it from Venezuela, to push Nicaragua back into a state of savage slavery, to isolate Cuba so that the people who America had turned into prostitutes and turned their country into gambling dens for gangsters, now they want to push that back. And of course, Africa is incredible. So we live in a world today where 80% of the people on the planet Earth are trying to survive off $10 US or less a day. And 50% of the people on the planet Earth are trying to survive off $2.50 or less a day. And when you look at Africa, you're looking at people where they work all day just to get a meal. Yet Africa is the richest continent on earth in terms of natural and material resources. It doesn't make any sense at all, except Africa and the ongoing military aggression that's been made against Africa, that was made in 1415, initiated by the Portuguese in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, that has dispersed the African nation across the globe, that has been responsible for this artificial national consciousness that has been imposed on us, a fake national consciousness, so that we were no longer Africans as we were when we got on the ship in Africa. Now we've become other kinds of things where we can't recognize each other. Africans disappeared the moment we got on the ship, and now we're no longer Africans, we're Jamaicans, we're Ghanaians. They cut up Africa into 54 parcels and gave it out to different European powers in 1884 and 85. England, you have this. Germany, you have this. Belgium, you have this. And just shared out Africa to all these white countries, and Africa is starving. And African people around the world are starving because Africa itself has been under assault and has been neutralized as a power and a force that can serve Africa and African people. That's the reality we are confronted with. So this ain't about we shall overcome. This ain't about hands up, don't shoot. We are part of a revolutionary project. I want to say what happened, of course, in the 1960s. We saw a point in history where revolution was the main trend in the entire world, where the oppressed peoples of the world demonstrated their opposition to Europe and America, dominating all our resources and taking for themselves the future of our children and our people. And the revolution happened everywhere, all around the world. And of course, what we saw during that period was a vicious counterinsurgency that the United States was leading. And it murdered people all around the planet. You saw the Agent Orange, or heard about it, that was dropped on the people of Vietnam. They're still suffering the consequence of that. Yes. Of course, what happened to Africans here, and some of that is not known to many people, but the prison population in this country quadrupled in a relatively short period of time in this country. SWAT teams, special military operations, this whole process now of the Pentagon being able to have this huge budget that includes sending what they like to call surplus weapons to police stations, police organizations throughout this country. How can it be a surplus that's been going since 1970? How can it be a surplus? That's the budget. That's the Pentagon budget. It violates constitutional provisions that prohibits the military from doing work in the country. And so now the police departments have become arms of the Pentagon that carries out functions in our communities. That's how somebody could go to the police department in Dallas, Texas, when this brother began to shoot back, and went to the police department, got a robot, got C4 explosives, and used the weapon to kill this brother. So this is the reality we are confronted with. But, comrades, you don't like it and I don't like it. And that's why we're here. And something is happening throughout this world. You don't have to be that smart to see it. And part of what's happening throughout this world is a real serious kind of consolidation of white consciousness and patriotism. Whether it is a patriotism of the Donald Trump kind or patriotism of the Bernie Sanders kind. And I mention Bernie Sanders particularly because he is somebody that's misleading people who want a different way of life. He's telling the people that he's some kind of socialist. And he's telling the people that you can achieve this socialism by getting $15 per hour over a number of years. That ain't socialism. Socialism is when the working class comes to power. Socialism is when the workers succeed in destroying the capitalist state and seize power and the means of control in our own hands, where the people who produce value are the ones who control the value. And the people who produce values are the ones who control the societies where that value is being expressed and spent. The workers have to come to power. And then when the workers come to power, they'll tell Bernie, maybe you'll get $15 an hour over a number of years. But this benevolent capitalism is not what we are looking for. And it's never going to be a solution. So finally, because I'm trying to be disciplined, I'm trying to be disciplined, because I got to sit down. But I do think it's important for everybody to understand that we are part of the African Revolution. We're conscious of that reality. We're conscious that we are Africans. We can't be an African and American at the same time. That's a contradiction in terms. That's like being a slave and a slave master. How are you going to be both? The fact is that America was born at the expense of Africa. We were Africans when we left Africa. We were Africans when we got here. And if you don't have a certain kind of intervention from the state, that's something that's easy to understand. Children understand it. Explain it to your child. Explain it to your kindergarten child. And that child will get it right away. It's those of us who have been so victimized by bourgeois colonial education that have problems grappling with this. So I want to thank you. I want to call on you to join, because we're moving beyond this time in history where we can just be consumers of information, we come out and we get all the information and we get the best rap in the barbershop. We have to move beyond that. We have to assume our responsibility. And our responsibility is to seize control of our lives. We complain about Trump, we complain about Cuomo, we complain about all these other cretins out there who say that they represent us. Well, they can do that because we don't actively engage in representing ourselves. You must join the struggle for reparations. This is why the question of reparations is so important, because it flips the script. It is the way that we begin to deprive the parasite of the resources that is required for its existence. It is the way for white people to rectify your relationship with the rest of the world. It is the way that white people can end this voluntary isolation from everybody else, where you have to live behind security bars and duck every time you think a black person is walking behind you and things like that, because you're damn right he wants his shit back. And but we can change all of that. We can change this relationship, and the biggest contradiction that we are confronted with, and one the world has been confronted with for the longest period of time, is white people. What the hell are you going to do to get off your asses and stop living off the rest of the world and join with us in tearing this system down and building a society that all of us can live in?